As architects, both in purpose and projects, I believe we should be champions for a just and equitable environment. If not, what are we doing? As a black architect, it's not my desire to work or live in separate worlds. One where architecture has no meaning, and the other where blackness has no relevance. So I choose to be an activist architect. This class is for architects, it's for urbanists, it's for urban designers, it's for urban planners, but more importantly, it's for the public. We need you to hold us accountable. I'm Dr. Craig Wilkins, and welcome to my class. Activist architecture might be best understood as a collaborative, participatory process of environmental creation in which communal sustainability and environmental justice influence the physical growth and economic direction of the built environment, and ultimately results in what might be called an aesthetic of equity. The ideological foundation of activist architecture lies in its refusal to believe that local communities working closely with architects and urbanists are without power over their built environment. A belief that architecture has the power to change material conditions and can have a positive, progressive impact on the daily lives of residents at all scales, from the street to the neighborhood to the city and all points in between. An activist practice can be understood as a way of perceiving, teaching, and working that derives from, is relevant to, and honestly engages the community in which the work is placed. Now, a key component of such a practice is advocating for social and environmental justice for those whose voices don't always receive a full hearing. It's particularly relevant as a method of working in under-resourced or completely neglected locations. And in this country, that all too often means Black and brown communities. I'm a Chicagoan by birth. I was born in Inglewood and I was raised in Roseland. My family currently lives in Beverly. Now, all three of these neighborhoods are on the predominantly Black side of town, the south side of Chicago. Now, Chicago, along with Detroit and Boston and a few others, is consistently ranked in the top 5 most racially segregated cities in the United States. But segregation doesn't always equate with poor. I had a very stable and enjoyable childhood. And while it may have actually been true, I never felt a lack of anything in my life. This included education as well. So I attended Lindblom Technical High School. It's one of 2 college prep public high schools at the time in the city of Chicago. Now, college prep is equated to what we call today like selective enrollment or magnet schools. In other words, it was very difficult to get into and even more difficult to complete. But I loved it. Even after getting suspended, So, part of Lynn Bloom's curriculum included 2 semesters of technical drawing or drafting, whatever term you'd like to use. And all students had to take it. Didn't matter what your interests were, you still had to take it, which is fine by me. I knew my way around the drafting board, and so I did relatively well. In fact, quiet as it's kept, I made a few dollars on the side doing homework for other students, or that were perhaps artistically challenged. Mechanical and freehand drawing came naturally to me. So when it came time to choose a college career, I chose architecture. Although I preferred to do commercial art, what we call graphic art now, because at the time I thought I could be a cartoonist. But then I realized, well, I can't be funny 365, so architecture's probably better. But both of those, cartoonist and architect, were default career choices because I really wanted to play baseball. But after a few months in college, I realized the difficulty of building models on the back of a bus. So I thought, well, I have to choose. And since I was not on scholarship, which meant I wasn't really very good, I chose architecture. However, had I known that you could sit on the bench, rarely pay, and make $1 million, I doubt we'd be having this conversation right now. I'd be doing something else entirely. I chose architecture. Mind you, I'd never met an architect, much less a black architect. But it never occurred to me that I couldn't be an architect. Now, I attribute that to my parents, who were what I'd like to call casual overachievers. So my father was a letter carrier who learned computer programming via correspondence course at night. And he rose to be the chief systems analyst for the entire Chicago public school system. That's a fancy way of saying in charge of all computer programming. My mother began as a teller at the First National Bank of Chicago, which is now Chase Bank. And she rose to become the second black female branch president that they ever had. Still, they were also very culturally aware. Both were involved in organizations like Reverend Jesse Jackson's Operation Breadbasket and the Black Expo. They believed in doing for themselves, but also helping others as well. And they surrounded themselves with professionally and socially like-minded friends. In our extended family group, doing your best was simply the rule. Doing good was the norm. Success was expected. We didn't do failure in that circle. So, you know, if I couldn't be a successful baseball player, I was expected to be a successful something. So I decided, well, I'd be a successful architect. My first full-time job after graduation was in the Washington office of Devereaux and Purnell. It was a black firm. Yes, it was in the Black City. Bonus, it was great. Many of my then colleagues are still good friends today. However, there was a moment during those halcyon days that would be the first nudge off my expected career path. DC is where I experienced, for the first time, chronic homelessness. It was difficult to reconcile with my rather untroubled life to that point. How could this be in the capital of one of the wealthiest nations in the world, on the earth? How are there people with no homes, with nowhere to go? I didn't understand it. I mean, we have resources. So although I was barely in the field, I still knew a little something about what it took to construct a home, to build a building, a spec office. I knew it could be addressed. But while I had little understanding on the design and construction side, I had no understanding at all on the political or financial side. So, me being me, I set out to learn. So, I left DC, headed to New York, enrolled in a graduate program for real estate and urban development. So, my goal was to learn as much as I can about the process, return to DC, and perhaps begin creating affordable projects in the city. Now, it was during this time in New York, I happened to attend a party at a friend's house or a friend's apartment in Chicago. There, I met another architect, and we were chatting, and somehow I got around to why I was in New York. And so I shared with him why I was there, and he was less than impressed. I remember the exchange going something like this. So, how long have you wanted to be an architect? I said, I don't know, 10 years, maybe more. Does high school count? He said, how long have you wanted to be a sociologist? I was confused. I said, never. He said, exactly, because you cannot be both. I was even more confused. First, I never said I wanted to be a sociologist. He assumed that because I wanted to place people and not profit at the center of my work, I couldn't really be an architect. Later that night, I went from confused to angry. I thought, well, hell, why not? Why can't I be concerned with more than just profit? Why can't someone be a sociologist and an architect? Then I found out the hard way that he was not alone in his thinking. In fact, his was the overwhelming sentiment of just about every architect, developer, municipality, agency, or institution involved with shaping the built environment I met. The architect's sole concern is for creating the most pleasing product for the client. Architects build buildings, not communities, he said that night. That's not our job. As my attempt to establish an office was floundering when I was in New York, I took on a few teaching positions to help stay afloat. And so I brought this conundrum, which was really a conundrum to me, to campus. I didn't expect it to become the through line for my work to this day. Why do we, and almost everyone with whom we work, think this way? And I think I have an answer to share today. At least an answer that fuels my work and makes me happy. I was 23 or 24 by the time I first met a black architect. His name was Andrew Hurd. I'll never forget him. He had an office in downtown Chicago on Michigan Avenue. Now, I came across him because I just happened to pick up a special issue of Black Enterprise magazine in our house that profiled black architects in Chicago, and he was on the cover. I cold called him that day and begged him to visit. He agreed. And when I arrived, he was extremely gracious. He stayed after work a couple hours to talk to me about his work, his progression in the field, the difficulties of being a black architect, and how proud he was of all he'd accomplished. He wasn't defiant. He was encouraging. He was supportive. I saw in him what I'd seen in my parents, a kind of casual overachievement. Like, given the slimmest of chances, this is what we can do. I decided when I graduated that I was going to go work for a black firm. Little did I know the dismal numbers of black architects in the country. And if I had, I may have given that pursuit some significant pause. Today, less than 3% of licensed architects in the United States are Black. Over the past 30 years, that number has remained flat, despite all other demographics increasing. More so, less than 0.5 licensed architects are Black women. I think the number currently stands at maybe somewhere between 500 and 600 total, period, in the entire country, for as long as there have been licensed architects. Can you imagine? Can you imagine knowing by name or recognition every architect that looks like you in the country? Just let that sink in. Now, had I known the legacy of Black architects' contributions to the profession, academia, and the nation, that pause would have lasted less than a nanosecond. For example, Paul Williams, who designed over 3,000 buildings all over the world. He was the architect to the stars. He designed homes for Frank Sinatra, Cary Grant, Lucille Ball. This is a Black man. He learned to draw upside down, so his clients didn't have to sit next to him because it made them uncomfortable. Julian Abel, who designed over 400 works of architecture, including Duke University, the iconic buildings at Duke University, yet he could not step foot on its campus. Robert Taylor, who's a graduate of MIT, designed and built Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University, while teaching the next generation of Black architects. Vertner Woodson Tandy was a graduate of Cornell who designed the mansion of the first Black female millionaire in this country, Madam C.J. Walker. Norma Sklaric, principal of her own firm, first Black woman to be admitted into the American Institute of Architects and the first to be elevated to its College of Fellows, the highest honor the Institute bestows upon its members. Adding to her legacy is native Detroiter Kim Dowdell, the first Black female president of the American Institute of Architects in its 155-year history. I wanted, in some small way, to be part of that legacy. I still do. When all said and done, I hope I will be. Oh, and by the way, none of what I just mentioned I learned in school. None. Not one piece. I was never taught anything about the rich history of Black architects in this country in any class I ever took. And I have a PhD. This is a problem, and part of my work is to fix it. So, over the past 2+ decades, I've had the opportunity to think long and hard about what it means to practice. To whom are we responsible? To what end? How do we know? Why do we get to do what we do in a built environment? What is our role in the public sphere? What do we contribute? Now, as an architect, these questions are of interest to me. As an academic, they are even more of interest. But as a Black person in America, whose communities are significantly impacted by the answers to those questions, they are beyond mere interest. They are imperative. So, in trying to come to grips with competing claims about what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do, who are we doing it for, I've done a good deal of research into the concept of professions and professionals, primarily because it's in the professional realm where answers should be easy to find. Now, one of the more significant things I discovered is that just because you get paid to do a job, a service, or have a career, that alone does not constitute a profession or make one a professional in the true sense of the term. Now, this misunderstanding is significant because it dominates the common understanding of what a professional is. Financial compensation for expertise or service alone is not what it means to be a professional. Professionals have a higher calling, a larger duty, a grander responsibility than simply fee for service. So I know what I'm about to argue will be somewhat counterintuitive, maybe even a little insulting, but hear me out. Now, before I begin, I want to make it perfectly clear that I am not at all denigrating the career choices of anyone. We all are free to do what we want, hopefully what we like. Of course, the best scenario is to do what you love. Now, I applaud and support any exploration of what that might be for anyone. The point I am making here is that there are real differences between the pursuit of a career, passionate as that might be, and the pursuit of a professional career. Now, let me explain. There are varying degrees of how professions or professionals have been defined in dictionaries and papers and books and research. However, in almost every definition, there are three elements that remain consistent. First is that there is a specific body of knowledge. The field has determined a standard that everyone must master. The mastery of such is certified in some manner. A license, a certificate, something that indicates to the public that it can expect a certain basic level of competence and service that has been independently verified and can be checked. In short, anyone, any professional with this validation can be trusted. This is for the public's benefit. The second is the freedom to offer that validated service exclusively. No one without this certification is allowed to claim he, she, or they can provide the same level of expertise without real punishment under the law. Like, I can't get up and say, I'm a doctor, and begin to practice medicine. I'm going to jail. With this validation comes a market monopoly. No one can do what I do unless they have what I have. Like, I can wake up tomorrow and call myself an artist. I could be a bad artist, but I'm not going to jail for being an artist. I would go to jail if I called myself a doctor. Okay, now, the last of these three standards recognizes that because the profession enjoys this monopoly, there is a duty to provide access to their expertise to all, not just the highest bidder. These elements are always in any definition of profession. The pay is the recompense. It is not the reason. Professions differ from other types of jobs and careers because they have this explicit public component. Two, through their knowledge, expertise, application, and monopoly to make our lives better. This is the social contract. Professionals who are in the professions get something, and the public gets something. There is no right to practice any profession. It is a privilege. And that privilege is granted to you by the society you live in. And it comes with responsibilities, namely to use your skills for the betterment of everyone, not just your client. Sorry, that's the deal. You buy the ticket, you take the ride. So, how do professions do this? What is the method, the infrastructure by which each communicates its acceptance of that responsibility? Communicates it to its members, to students, to the public, and to its clients. Now, to answer that, let's look at the titular big three professions, right? Medical, legal, and architecture. And let's see how each makes clear its understanding of their responsibility to the public. The medical profession has a motto: always seek to do good, but first do no harm. And we usually only hear the last part: first do no harm. That is a simple explanation of how the profession makes our lives better. It's condensed into a very clear statement of its public promise, the Hippocratic Oath. And that's a field-wide stance. It is not an individual one. You don't get to pick and choose. So, in other words, they're literally saying, listen, we promise not to make a situation worse. We'll try to make it better, but we promise not to make a situation worse. So the infrastructure in which they set up to allow their members to practice that public responsibility. First is pro bono work. Like, every physician is expected to provide service in crisis. It's a guarantee of service. It's illegal, for example, it's illegal to not provide service when someone comes into the ER. It's illegal. You will lose your license. Medical clinics, they set up medical clinics where you can go and consult a doctor or nurse or some other healthcare agent with little to no pay. Again, the expertise is available to everyone. Student loan forgiveness. If you work in the public sector, like in a rural area that has, there's no doctor within 500 miles, there's no hospital, or if you run a health clinic or are involved in a nonprofit organization, you can get your loans forgiven. Why? Because that profession recognizes that it has a responsibility. Now, let's look at the legal profession. They too have a motto: better 100 go free than one innocent be convicted. Now, that is a very short but clear statement of what they believe their responsibility is to the public. If you're not guilty, we fight to keep you out of jail or being convicted. Doesn't matter if you can pay. Again, it's a field-wide position. Everyone who goes into law recognizes that responsibility. Now, what is the infrastructure, right? Pro bono work, again, like the medical profession. Every law firm is strongly encouraged to do pro bono work, and almost every law firm does. In other words, and what I mean by pro bono work is work that you do for free or for a very little amount of money. It's important. Sometimes folks really need help, but they can't afford to pay for it. As a professional, you have to figure that out. So, pro bono work. Also, they offer a guarantee of service. And that guarantee of service is criminal case. You are guaranteed representation. Guaranteed, whether you can pay for it or not. Guaranteed access to our expertise. There are law clinics, like there are medical clinics or health clinics, where you can consult with a lawyer with little to no pay. And they also have a student loan forgiveness program for working in the public sector, like a public defender's office, or if you run a law clinic or a nonprofit organization. Now, let's look at architecture. And I ask my students this all the time. Well, what is our model? What is our stance? Because they know those other ones. Maybe they know medical one, maybe a little more than they know the legal one, but they know them. And I say, okay, well, what is our stance as a profession? No answer. Confusion. Ours is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. That's a clear and unambiguous statement on how we are supposed to make lives better. Okay, now, where's the infrastructure? It doesn't exist. We don't have it. We don't have it. Now, let me put this another way, because this might be a bit abstract, but let me put it another way. If someone is having a health crisis in the public, and the question is asked, is there a doctor in the house? And there was, but that person did nothing, or before doing something, that person asked, well, what kind of insurance do you carry? How will you be paying for this service? We, as a public, would find that abhorrent and indefensible. Further, that doctor might find themselves in trouble with the law or the medical board. Let's say the state, with all its resources, assembled its power to prosecute someone that could not afford competent representation. Anyone to assist in their defense, and thereby assuring that they would be convicted regardless of whether the charges were accurate. We, as the public, would also find that reprehensible. It's unjust, and the system exists for justice. So, if it's not okay for a doctor or lawyer to ignore an immediate crisis in their respected areas of expertise, how is it that architects can cast their eyes on the state of our environment, which is indeed an immediate crisis, and say, or do, well, nothing? Should that be possible? I argue no. To protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public is why we have a license. It's why we have the exclusive right to practice architecture. As a matter of fact, it's the only reason. It's not because we design beautiful buildings, which we often do, but the aesthetic quality of any structure, the beauty as an object is never included in any licensing criteria, ever. While every state has some version of the protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public justification for practice, it is clear the desire to do so within the profession varies from practitioner to practitioner. This has got to end. The public must hold the profession accountable for this gap. The apparent indifference to holding up our end of the bargain on a consistent basis has got to stop. Now, yes, I realize this is a lot to ask, professionally, educationally, culturally, but we really have no other choice. Access to space is essential for life opportunities and choices, right? Public space is the wellspring from which all other benefits flow, like health and wealth and prosperity, providing citizens with clean air and clean water, as well as opportunities for healthy foods and green space and safe recreation, public transportation, the performance of unique and essential cultural practices. I would argue that a safe, healthy, responsive, and supportive environment is as much of a right as free speech. Indeed, it's not hyperbole to say that space is life. Now, as architects, we manipulate, we refine, and we deploy space. We make it accessible or not. We make it pleasing or not. We make it egalitarian or not. We make it public, private, or somewhere in between simply by how it's organized, what it communicates, what it authorizes, and what it does not. Architects can create spaces so off-putting that no amount of signage and begging will ever make it welcoming, despite its public intention. Alternatively, we can make a space so inviting, engaging, and life-affirming that no barrier can keep people out, despite its private purpose. Access to its benefits is so important that no one entity should be allowed to unilaterally decide how space should be used, who should have access to it, and under what conditions. Everyone in this course knows someone who was born into the benefits of space. Perhaps some know someone or someones who weren't, yet overcame that condition. A few might know someone or someones who didn't, couldn't, or worse still, were kept from overcoming it and are still being kept from overcoming it. No one entity, institution, agency, municipality, or corporation should have the overriding authority to determine what we as citizens can become, individually and collectively. But it happens every day. It happens all the time, always, and in all ways. As architects, both in purpose and projects, I believe we should be champions for a just and equitable environment. If not, what are we doing? The problems of the poor are not because they are poor, but because they are treated poorly. So poorly, they can only be poor. For example, did you know that in today's America, one's zip code is the most accurate single indicator of life expectancy. It has been argued that it's more important than your genetic code. This is astounding to me. That in places like in Philadelphia, a mile apart, two different zip codes, there's a 20-year discrepancy. 20 years within a mile. And this is partly because, there's no investment in those areas. There's not a strong community advocacy. There are no hospitals. There are no health centers. These things don't exist. But that's amazing. And that is a spatial issue. Also, did you know that more than half of all the people in the United States who live within 2 miles of a hazardous waste facility are people of color? More than half. The burdens of pollution, toxic waste, and poisoned resources are not distributedly equally across society. That's a spatial issue. The cities of San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan, as they are currently constructed, can fit into the boundaries of Detroit. That's 3 million people that can fit into the boundaries of Detroit. Each one of them have a public transportation system that is central to its operation. Is it perfect? No. But the system provides for movement to jobs, to schools, to shopping, to leisure. Places without reliable systems isolate people and lead to other problems associated with that isolation, like poverty and economic instability. These are spatial issues. No other than the eminent legal scholar and activist, John Powell, has observed that in this country, space is how race is played out. What has happened in places like Baltimore and St. Louis and Cleveland, Detroit and Portland, and dozens of other cities is a result, as much a result, of the profession abandoning its responsibilities to the public realm as it is any other. Not only have we been silent on the theft of resources, we've also been complicit in constructing barriers that keep those resources safely out of the hands of those from which it was taken. We've looked the other way in the former and pretended not to understand the latter. We've settled for a municipal and, to a certain degree, professional acceptance of what urban geographer Rashad Shabazz calls architectures of confinement. This has to change. We must do better as professionals and as people. Now, when the public doesn't hold architecture accountable, architecture happens to it. And when that occurs, it is frequently a problem, especially for disenfranchised communities, Black communities, brown communities. In those places, architecture is typically a burden. It's hardly ever a blessing. I want to change that relationship. Now, I think it's Albert Einstein, which is reported to have said, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. Architecture doesn't have to happen to people. They can happen to it. Architecture can happen with people. The sanctioned and equitable distribution of resources and the resulting lopsided benefits have created the landscape you see today. Vast swaths of cities are in survival mode. Now, as Whitney Young of the Urban League said, some 50 years ago, two architects at their national convention. Architects share the responsibility for the mess we are in. It didn't just happen. We didn't just suddenly get in this situation. It was carefully planned and executed. We had a hand in that. I want to share with you something my grandmother said so, often, actually. Land is the one thing God ain't making more of. Now, set aside the religious connotation if you like, but in essence, she was right. The world is becoming more and more environmentally uninhabitable yearly. We are losing space, whether to global warming, mismanagement, erosion, contamination, and other forces that threaten life on this earth. We need to protect this precious, limited gift. And a large part of participants on that line of defense is supposed to be us, architects, the self-proclaimed stewards of the built environment. Now, the 2021 Venice Biennale asked this question as its theme: how will we live together? And all the works exhibited there were to respond to that query. Now, I, along with a few others, was asked to respond in writing. My response was, as you might imagine, activist architecture. Now, I wrote that as a profession, we can no longer afford to sit back and wait for municipalities or public agencies to send out a request for qualifications or proposals for work. Nor should we wait for private corporations and developers or individuals to bring us projects. If architecture is to remain viable as a profession, not as a practice, as a profession, it will have to shed this traditional model of patronage and evolve into something more, some version of an activist model. And it will have to communicate and demonstrate why design matters to everyone, always, and in all ways. So my piece proclaimed that the age of the gentleman architect, the traditional passive provider of expertise and service, is dead, or it should be. It's my position that the age of the activist architect, where we proactively engage, work on behalf of the public, is upon us. That we need to address conditions in the built environment wherever we find them, whether we're asked directly to do so or not. That the activist architect seeks to address problems, not projects. This architect brings work that is needed to be done to institutions, agencies, municipalities on behalf of the common, of communities, on behalf of the public, and seeks funding to execute them. This is the architect who embraces the concept of public interest design. The architect you find at community design centers, The architect you find at local block club meetings, listening, talking, rallying, and designing. This is the everyday architect who's not waiting for the spectacle, the grand project that will the be all and end all and get them on a magazine. But they will gladly take it if it comes, but not waiting on it. This is the architect that understands that life happens in the everyday and that the everyday gets little to no love due to the long lines of experts waiting to bid on the spectacle. This is the architect who calls the CEOs of local industries as well as the CEOs of the local community development corporations by their first names. This is the architect that demonstrates her, his, or their value by challenging the common misconceptions about who is authorized to contribute to, access, find joy, and sanction in the built environment. The architect who understands that if we are going to live together, we have to learn to live differently. And that means we have to learn to practice differently. This is the architect that has seen way too many Just Do It commercials. What is needed is a full-on, continuous conversation with the public about the role of design that isn't reduced to the aesthetic value by default. Architects have to re-engage meaningfully in contributing local, national, and global knowledge. It demands a reconsideration of the act, the purpose, and objects of architecture, how we talk about them, and more importantly, with whom we talk about them. Okay. I can already hear folks shouting in the background saying, where are these people? Where are these architects? Do they exist? Yes, they do. In fact, they do. They're rare, but they do. I consider myself one. But you know how long it's taken me to get here. We can't wait another 30 years for a slow burn. We need to make them now, right now. This is urgent. And this is where the public can play the greatest part. Demand that the profession set up the infrastructure and provide the support to perform its professional duty. Demand access to that expertise. Demand that it protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, or you lose the monopoly to practice. You give up the right to a license. Then you can go do whatever you want, however you want, whatever you want, with whomever you want. But you can't have both. If you're not holding up your end of the bargain, if you have failed to deliver on your part of the contract, then the contract becomes null and void. That's just how it works. When communities are under attack by gentrification or indifference, when private interests or municipal desires complete with their cadre of planners and architects and accountants and lawyers and allied professionals seek to shape our shared landscape to their vision, communities should be able to say, well, that's fine. It's a very interesting proposition. But let's have a second opinion. What does our architect think? What does our planner say? We should provide that. No one has a right to practice architecture. It's a privilege. And if you're not holding up your end of the bargain, then you can't expect to reap the benefits. Access to our expertise should be available to all. We have to see that as part of practice, as part of architecture. as part of our joy in doing what we do. It's a promise that we've made, and it's a promise that we should keep. The public deserves no less. The first thing I'd like to sort of have you think about or consider is that I believe that architecture is both a noun and a verb. It is a thing and a process, an object and an objective. In my world, if one helps a community envision a better future, one has practiced architecture. If one has educated the public on issues related to design, one has practiced architecture. If one has participated in rewriting codes that assist the construction or the use of something prohibited but essential, one has practiced architecture. If you have educated a developer or potential partners of a poor track record of folks with whom they work, a poor track record on justice and equity issues, then you have practiced architecture. So the moment I sit down with a client, or the moment I take on a community, I'm practicing architecture, and I dare anybody to tell me that's not what architecture is. For far too long, we've cultivated a narrow understanding of what we do. It's incumbent upon us to change that, to broaden the definition of what it means to practice architecture. Two, that through a deep egalitarian collaboration, architects can help communities maintain and further develop assets of their own, as well as link with other communities going through a similar process, rather than waiting for capital to find it. That way you are ultimately becoming better to withstand capital when it does find you, or find your space attractive, or better yet, to attract capital on their own terms. Citizens can demand better conditions rather than capitulate to poor ones. Architects, like those who exhibited in the 2021 Chicago Biennale, which I thoroughly suggest anyone who's interested in these issues visit. They have shown us ways to engage resource-starved communities and help alleviate their hunger by co-creating scenarios of sustenance. A third is a more equitable and just environment is not a zero-sum proposition. It's not. What's the saying? When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That's the thinking that has to change, because it's not oppression. The way in which our shared resources are inequitably distributed, that is oppression. Look at the response to the execution of scores of unarmed Black women and men by police. The most notable in the media, at least, being George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And the disproportionate burden COVID placed on Black and brown communities. This conflation of horrible events reveal just how inequitable and unjust the environment really is. Justice is a spatial issue as much as it is anything else. Each of those events made that oppression visible. As members of a society, we can't run away from that. Not if we truly want to call ourselves a civil society. And as architects, we can't run away from that. Not if we want to be true to our professional duty. 4, the profession has always positioned itself as an artistic endeavor that produces beauty. And it does. Beautiful buildings abound all over the world. And from the first moment at my high school, Lindblom, I've been taught to believe the end all and be all of practice is to create a building, a beautiful object. This is why we do what we do, I've been told. And with apologies to Public Enemy, I admit for the longest time, I believed the hype. Over my almost 40 years in the field, yes, it's been a very, very slow burn. I've come to disagree with the belief that architecture equals building only. Too much of what we do as architects is focused solely on the aesthetic object. We've been taught to think that's all that matters. Everything else is subservient, if not impediment. And that keeps us from providing to our clients and the public the full breadth of our professional expertise. And that's to the detriment of all involved. It's time for us to add visible ethics to our pursuit of visual aesthetics. 5, a colleague of mine is fond of saying, architecture is never neutral. It either hurts or it heals. We must think more granularly about what we do. Think more holistically about what we do. More equitably about what we do. The environments we create, the resources we use to create them. Think more broadly about how we can help. We must create a just environment. No one place should have more environmental burden than any other. We have a say-so in that as architects. We create these conditions. We certainly participate in the process, which means we can create different conditions. It's not about the object, it's about the objective. What are we doing to make our shared spaces better, more just, more equitable, more accessible, more inviting? How does the practitioner in the profession demonstrate concern for the health, safety, and welfare of the public? Sometimes it's as simple as saying to a developer, wow, yes, that's a great project. Thanks for bringing it. I'd be happy to help you with that. It's needed. Who are your funders? Ooh, sorry. That bank doesn't live up to its Community Reinvestment Act obligations. It never has. I can't work with you if you're going to use a bank that won't invest in the neighborhood. I won't help you further disinvest a neighborhood. I won't. Find another bank and I will help you. Here's a list of those who actually do follow their Community Reinvestment Act obligations. But I'm not going to participate in further alienating people in that neighborhood. I won't. And by the way, don't be surprised if you choose to continue or ignore my words or continue to work with that particular bank. Don't be surprised if you see me at the planning commission meetings, at the community meetings, saying the exact same thing. Sometimes it's as simple as writing an op-ed, a column, an article, or a think piece. Heaven knows there are enough online outlets for looking for smart, insightful content. Writing is a great way to engage the public. Other times, it's more complicated than that. And every time it's difficult. Think about this, but if more opportunities to provide our expertise are a fallout of this kind of thinking and doing, the broader definition of what an architect can provide gradually becomes part of the thinking of corporations, industries, governments, communities, foundations, institutions, you name it. The result might be that architects get a call for services on the front end before all the decisions have been made, rather than where we typically get involved is on the back end, after all decisions have been made. How many of us wouldn't jump at that opportunity? If we had the kind of commitment, infrastructure, and support the legal and medical professions have to show the public why they are valuable, perhaps we'd get a lot more of those calls. And maybe, just maybe, we'd have a lot more people doing what I'm trying to do. This project was a project that we did and when I was director of the Detroit Community Design Center. And the city put out a request for proposals to see what might be done with the many closed schools that they had in their possession. And we were selected, and 2 schools in 2 areas of town were selected, and we got to work. And we worked with local organizations, residents, anybody who wanted to participate in the process. It was a 6-month process. We created a series of workshops, talked about what they might want, to look at the kinds of things that are available in other parts of the United States, how some of these things might be modified to happen here in Detroit. It was a whole expansive investigation of the kinds of lives that people wanted to lead in those neighborhoods, and how can this physical plant, this school, which when it was open was a symbol of that neighborhood, right? This is where all our kids go. This is where, we have after school programs. This is where we have folks in the auditorium doing plays. This is a symbol, a representation of what that community's life was like. How can we do that again in a place that had represented that kind of communal energy for so long? As I mentioned, we had these community organization meetings. We also met often with the Planning Commission and the city itself and various agencies to try to figure out exactly how to move forward with this project and what we could do. Now, ultimately, we produced a proposal that included things like childcare and elder care, community kitchens, life skills centers, spaces specifically designated for residential business opportunities, like folks who do hair or teach cooking classes. There was a tech center, farming, public gardens, tutoring opportunities, multimedia studios, and performance spaces for kids who, maybe want to do films, they want to do music. These are all things that we were considering in both these locations. And these didn't come from us. This work was, in a sense, sort of realized by those in the neighborhood and community who knew the desires of the people who lived there. Ultimately, the work was packaged into a brochure and sent to developers, which was its actual purpose, was to try to show developers how these buildings might be repurposed to spur some new thinking about their next project, to get them to invest not only in the physical plant of the school itself, but the social plant, if you can call it that, of the neighborhoods and communities that were surrounded by them. One of those projects, one of those schools that we worked on actually became, or is right now, a repurposed charter school. So there is life in that building again. Next one I want to talk about happened in Minneapolis. Now, the essence of this particular problem was that the city of Minneapolis built public housing. And they built this public housing back in the 40s. They built it over substandard land. And so the people who lived there for 50 years are subjected to just the worst kinds of living conditions. Because they were in a poor location, slabs were moving, things flooded all the time, buildings collapsed, roofs were in complete disrepair. So much so that the residents had to sue the city of Minneapolis, the housing authority, and by extension, because the housing authority got its money from the federal government, they had to sue HUD just to get them to acknowledge that this is not right. They came to an agreement, called a consent decree, and all parties agreed to a complete demolition of all the housing on the site and a thinking of what could actually happen. There were 776 units on that site. We were working as the community's architect. What had been decided was that they were going to replace those homes, those units, with a mix of market rate, affordable, and low-income housing. And of course, the city had their architects on their side, the developers had their architects on their side. We were hired to be the community's architect, to make sure they were fully invested and fully participating in the project. So we had a number of early planning and community meetings where people would engage to work. The final master plan was approved by the city of Minneapolis and Minneapolis Housing Authority. And today, this is what that area looks like. It is one of the more desirable places to live in the Twin Cities, when just maybe 15 years ago, no one wanted to live there at all. So this next project is a very small one, quick, that we did in the Design Center here in Detroit. We actually took a project to the community. We took an idea to the community. And the idea was that, we understand that Detroit transportation, public transportation, leaves a lot to be desired. And we were doing a little research on it, and we realized that at the time, I don't know what the numbers are now, but 40% of people in Detroit didn't own a car. That blew me away. This is automobile capital of the world, and 40% of the people didn't have a car. I think it was another 20% shared a car. So it means some days they had one, some days they didn't. So the point is that lots of people were dependent on alternate modes of transportation. Hopefully the public transportation, since we pay for that. At the same time, the city was beginning its, demolition of 2,000 homes a year. But where was that material going? It was going to go into landfills. and landfills are already filled. So we knew we couldn't do anything about making the buses run faster, not as a designer. As a person, as a citizen, yes, we can advocate for that. But design's not going to address the transportation, right? But we can make the wait a little bit more humane. You don't have to stand for 2 hours. These are sort of some ancillary things that we heard from folks when we were working on this project. That in the summertime, I can't buy ice cream. Why? Because I have to wait 2 hours for the bus to come and then another hour to get home. It's water by the time I get home. You can't have ice cream. That's silly. Shouldn't happen. Anyway, so we decided we would look at what was going on in the city. We saw that buildings were being torn down. There's a need for at least humane waiting areas. So we combined both of those. So we snuck into buildings, or decided we were going to sneak into buildings that were designated for deconstruction or destruction. Take doors, take as much of the material that we could possibly use. We took doors, we took studs, we took a bunch of other things. We applied for funding from the National Endowment of the Arts and got it. And we hired artists around the city to create places where people can sit. Beautifully designed places where people can sit. And we went and put these up all around the city. No one asked us to do it, but we knew it had to be done. Something had to be done. So we did it. The next project I want to talk about has to do with my desire to address the appalling number of Black architects in the field. Appalling. Part of the reason that this is the case is because most distressed communities do not think architecture is for them. They don't see how it has any juice. They tend to fight architecture because, you know, if architecture comes to their neighborhood, that usually means gentrification. The benefits aren't going to be for us. So it's not surprising that architecture really isn't high on the list of perhaps kids who want to go to college. They see it as a detriment. They don't see how it helps. So I wanted to change that. I wanted to be part of that change. Detroit used to have, I think, at least 4 architectural programs in their schools. There's Denby, there's Cass, and a couple of other schools. Now they're down to 1. We decided to create an after-school program for students who were interested in an architectural career. We'd introduce them to the processes of why architecture matters. We would introduce them to different parts of the city. We took them on field trips, primarily to Chicago. And we got them involved in actual neighborhoods and communities so they could actually see the power of design. They could see how architecture could change things. Now, this program was 16 weeks long. It was only a semester. And we met 2 times a week after school for, I think, maybe 2 hours. That program has now grown to a full half-day program where students not only get high school credit, but college credit for staying in this program. We are building a pipeline, so to speak, for more people to get involved in architecture. And some of the places that we actually worked were we worked with the Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries, DRMM. We worked with Trix Elementary. These are real places with real students, with real people, with real problems. And several of the projects that the students designed actually got built. So you could actually see the impact of what they were doing. I think this last project that I want to talk about is a project that has to do with the design or the design competition for the Detroit Institute of Arts. It was an international design competition which required a public component of all the teams that were selected for the finalists. The team I was on was one of 3 that was selected for a finalist out of, I think they have 41 entries, and they narrowed it down to 8, and then they narrowed it down to 3. We made the last cut. And I think part of what why I'm mentioning this is because even institutions like the DIA and the city are recognizing the need for public participation in projects. They are recognizing the value of that. And as a profession, we should be elated. We should be embracing this component. It is an opportunity for us to show our value beyond just an object. In these moments of engagement with the public, process is as important as product. I see architecture as both a noun and a verb. It's not only an object, but it's the objective. That is an activist practice that embraces the noun and the verb. These are but a few examples of what an activist practice engaged with the public might look like. Of course, there are many more, and perhaps more dramatic and impactful than these, but I hope you get my point. What I've illustrated here is not so much about the object, but the objective. Each example is less about what the architect wanted and more about what an activist architect can contribute to bringing together a larger local vision. My expertise is incredibly useful and multifaceted, but it is not by any means comprehensive or complete. The work done in each one of these examples was a collaborative, and the public share significant ownership of the result. Not only that, they've been heard, they've been valued, they've been respected along the way. Both of those are huge for the public in general, but incredibly so much more to the residents of distressed and disenfranchised communities. To be heard, to be respected, and to be valued. I do what I do because I believe that design has the power to change lives. And as an architect, I also embrace the idea that I'm a professional, that I have responsibilities. And I'm also deeply committed to the idea of social justice. My communities need my expertise. And it would be a dereliction. It would be architectural malfeasance if I did nothing. If any of this has resonated with you, I highly recommend you make yourself familiar with these resources. First, National Organization of Minority Architects, or NOMA for short. Dark Matter University. Black Space. Design as Protest. The Association for Community Design, or ACD. And read anything you can get your hands on about public interest design, social impact design, and social entrepreneurship. The world you're entering for practicing is different than the one that I entered. It took me 30 years, maybe even 40, to get to where I am right now. I'm where I am because this is where architecture needs to be. Don't wait 30 years to get here.